When people talk about anarchism, often, the thing that comes to mind are sort of, the Johnny Rotten figures, the sort of punk rock, rebels without a cause, that sort of has come to dominate the popular imagination. But anarchism actually has a long history of sort of economists and philosophers and other theorists.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 150 for the 19th of January 2023. I was talking to someone last night. I won't say who, but someone fairly well known for taking part in public debate. Robust, intense debate. Debates where people are strongly committed to their side of the argument and aren't afraid to let you know that. They'd been listening to the podcast that I did a while back on trans rights and the associated issues with Aoife Gallagher, and they said to me that although they had talked publicly about a number of other thorny political issues, they'd steered away from what is called the trans debate. I don't think that's a very good name for it, but I don't have a better one, so I'll go with that. They had steered away from what's called the trans debate, not because they don't have opinions on it, not because they don't think it's interesting, but purely because they were afraid of the potential backlash if they said the wrong thing, and they didn't really believe the right thing, so they said nothing. This isn't the first time that this has happened. Previously, I talked to a well-known public figure, someone whose name I'm sure every listener would recognise, and again, someone not shy to state their opinions strongly in robust debates on all sorts of topics. That person had also decided never again to comment on the trans issue. They had commented on it previously. What they said was in no way hateful, in no way bigoted, and for the most part supportive of the pro-trans position, if you want to call it that. But in an attempt to sensibly analyse the topic, they'd strayed from some details of what's sometimes called sarcastically the orthodox pro-trans rights position, and had received a barrage of abuse and name-calling as a result. That person decided that they would not discuss the topic publicly ever again. So to be clear, someone who's an opinion former, an influential person who publicly supported vindicating the rights of trans people will not now discuss the topic because of the abuse they received for not supporting trans rights in the perfectly acceptable way. This is not the way a healthy debate happens. And this has consequences. One of the consequences, and it's only one of them, there are many negative impacts of this, but one of the consequences is that the quality of the debate on this topic is the poorer for this. I got feedback from a couple of listeners to the interview with Aoife Gallagher who remarked on one question that I had asked that made them think. Aoife couldn't answer the question. She was very straight up about the fact that it hadn't occurred to her. But it's interesting that such an obvious question hasn't been teased out. The question was this: why is organising groups by sex, by biological sex, seen by some as unacceptable discrimination, but organising them by socially constructed gender is seen as required to vindicate trans people's rights? That's especially curious when the rationale for the separate groupings is based on sex characteristics. So the rationale for having separate rugby teams or separate changing rooms or separate services for new parents, that rationale springs directly from the differences between the biological sexes. It's not the same as having, let's say, separate knitting groups or separate school debating teams. Those separations are clearly based on socially constructed gender. Now, you could argue that the sex differences between people are sufficiently small as to mean that you don't really need to have, say, separate changing rooms. I won't get into that, but there's no question that the rationale for having separate rugby teams is that the overwhelming majority of women who now play rugby could not do so if a separate women's team did not exist. And the rationale for a separate team flows directly from the differences of biological sex. It has little or nothing to do with socially constructed gender roles. The question that hasn't been answered, it hasn't even been asked as far as I can tell, is why would separating rugby teams or reproductive health services by sex be considered unacceptable exclusion of trans people? But segregating them by gender is not only all right, but actually in some way signalling how progressive you are. I genuinely can't understand that rationale. I also noted the case of Ngozi Fulani and a woman with the ludicrous title of Lady Susan Hussey, Baroness Hussey of North Bradley, a lady of the household, which basically means she's someone considered posh enough to run errands for the English royalty. Susan Hussey asked Ngozi Fulani where she was from. In fact, Ngozi Fulani was born in London with the name Marlene Headley, but I've no doubt that question may well have been asked in a hostile or insensitive way that it wouldn't have been if Miss Fulani wasn't black. But there was some comment around that incident that basically implied that ever asking any member of a minority that question is automatically racist, or at a minimum, so insensitive as to be unacceptable. I would hope that Irish people can see through that overextension. It's a pretty normal thing. Maybe it's a small country thing for Irish people when first meeting to ask each other where they're from. It's sort of a negotiation of social relations, and in many cases people can pretty quickly identify an acquaintance in common. It's got more common to meet people from outside the country in social situations, whether they're immigrants, or foreign students, or refugees, or whatever, and conversation often starts off with asking the person where they're from. I think this is mostly expressing an interest in the other person, and it's mostly accepted as that. But I can understand that if your appearance or your accent marks you out as unlikely to be native Irish, that could get a bit tiresome after a while. But I don't think this comes nearly to the level of justifying saying, as the Stanford University harmful language policy did until it was pulled after much ridicule recently, that asking that question in any context is necessarily racist. That's obviously a nonsensical overextension. But here's the unaddressed contradiction. Some people have chosen to put their preferred pronouns in their email signature lines or on social media. Except that's wrong. According to the Stanford University harmful language policy, it's unacceptable to use the phrase preferred pronouns because that would call their validity into question. We should just say pronouns. So people publish their pronouns. Well, that's fine. It's up to them. Except it isn't always. Marks & Spencer employees in the UK were told that their pronouns would be printed on their name badges as part of the company's inclusion and diversity policy. In theory, this was optional for staff, but in reality, staff who didn't want this had to contact the Marks & Spencer HR department and opt out, implicitly telling their employer that they were against inclusion and diversity. That's a pretty significant deterrent to a supposedly optional policy. But the British bank Halifax didn't offer any options. They just announced similar name badges for their staff. On their official Twitter account, they said, "We strive for inclusion, equality, and quite simply in doing what's right. If you disagree with our values, you're welcome to close your account." Both companies were praised by various progressive groups for their new policies. But it's not hard to imagine that a member of staff might think that if they voiced disagreement, they would be told that they'd be welcome to find a job elsewhere as well. Now, pronouns are not an issue I care about at all. I think that it's so trivial that it's not worth a discussion, and I think that linguistic battles are a proxy for real battles, and we should just have the discussion about the real issue. But it seems glaringly obvious to me that inquiring into someone's personal, possibly sensitive information in one context is being blasted as racist, even if it's done in a friendly and pro-social way, but in another context, demanding that you literally wear a badge displaying personal, possibly sensitive information on pain of risking your job, this is seen as praiseworthy. That's glaringly inconsistent. I can put my hand on my heart and say that I have never heard this inconsistency raised or discussed, let alone explained, before. And I think that there's a reason for this. The reason is that the pussyfooting around the trans issue by people who are, possibly rightly, terrified that if they inadvertently say something that some self-appointed judge of what is and is not allowed to be said pronounces as unacceptable, they'll be subject to a flood of complaints, at best unpleasant and stressful, at worst possibly costing them their career. That said, I don't care about pronouns. Do what you like. But this is what I do care about. When there's no debate, bad ideas, inconsistent ideas don't get challenged. Remember that you don't learn from someone who you agree with on everything. Your ideas are improved by being challenged, by you thinking about the challenge and rising to the challenge to refine those ideas or to explain them better. The fact is that, to my personal knowledge, people refuse to enter that discussion because of its toxicity. That is not a win. If you think that bullying people out of disagreeing with you makes your argument stronger, you are very, very wrong. In a moment, we'll have that interview with Jessie Spafford. But first, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it, but we do get enough to cover the costs of the web hosting and the other costs of running the podcast. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron. It lets us know that people out there are listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in the Irish media, and you're more than welcome to listen for free. But if you think that you could do the same as those donors on Patreon and throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have Jessie Spafford, who's a research fellow at Trinity College Dublin, working on the REAL project, that's Rights and Egalitarianism. He has a research focus on ethics and political philosophy. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, Social Anarchism and the Rejection of Moral Tyranny, published by Cambridge University Press. Congratulations on that, Jessie. When you say anarchism, are you more Bakunin or more Johnny Rotten?
Thanks. That's a good question. Certainly more in the spirit of Bakunin or Peter Kropotkin, but with a bit more of a contemporary spin to it. So, I'm sort of operating more in the contemporary style of academic analytic political philosophy. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of trying to take the tools of contemporary political philosophy and apply them to sort of develop some of the ideas and intuitions, that people like Bakunin had. So for listeners who maybe don't know, when people talk about anarchism, often, the thing that comes to mind are sort of, the Johnny Rotten figures, the sort of punk rock, rebels without a cause, that sort of has come to dominate the popular imagination. But anarchism actually has a long history of sort of economists and philosophers and other theorists who have tried to develop various theories about how people can live together in ways that don't require a lot of coercion, in ways that let people live together sort of peacefully, in some sort of egalitarian fashion, by and large, without the state and usually sort of without markets or capitalism.
Okay, people have a fairly clear idea what communism is, which was one perhaps alternative to markets and capitalism that was practiced relatively widely up to the 1990s and perhaps may or may not be practiced in some isolated places still. I think you're right. Most people don't have a good idea of what anarchism would look like. So can you give me, rose-tinted or otherwise, your view of the anarchist future that you would dream of?
Well, so this is actually a bit of a tricky question for me because in some sense, I tend to shy away a little bit from giving these sort of prescriptions. So yeah, a lot of anarchists, that's sort of been their focus, is to try to lay out their sort of utopic vision of what society would look like that's both stateless and also has some alternative economic system that's non-market based and non-sort of capitalist based. But I actually, like I said, I shy away from that a little bit. And I'm more interested in sort of understanding anarchism as less of a sort of societal prescription and more of a personal moral philosophy that would give you sort of guidance in terms of how to structure your individual actions in sort of living within society as it exists today. So that's a little bit more my angle. And I tend to shy away from societal prescriptions in part because I think it's not fully clear I think it's more clear how we should conduct ourselves in the society as it exists. And it's a little bit less clear, if you were sort of given a wand and could reconstruct society from the ground up, what you should do. I think that's actually a bit of a hard question.
It is a hard question. That's why I'm asking it. But the one question, right. I will narrow it down slightly. And the one word that you put in there was stateless. And how does a stateless world or even a stateless country work?
Well, so again, this is also where I stake out a slightly unusual position from relative to other anarchists, because often, the kind of vision that anarchists will give you are things that are often a little bit, in a way utopic, but also sort of unrealistic. So for example, anarchists often envision sort of an alternative to the state is a way of governing and sort of structuring society in a way that doesn't just involve sort of a top-down organization issuing commands that people follow, even a democratically accountable one. So, for example, anarchists have often proposed things like models that would allow people to govern themselves and society through, say, pure consensus. So trying to get everybody to actually endorse how it is that society is going to be structured. So there are people have sort of proposed various ideas of, federations. So you have a small group of people and they sort of come to some kind of consensus, a unanimous decision about what to do. And then they send up a representative to a higher order sort of council. You have all these little groups of people, and they'll send up representatives to a higher level council, and then they'll all come to a consensus, and that will require some negotiations. And then they, go back down and then have to get final approval from all the members of each of their groups. And so that you end up with something like a purely consensus based decision about how to govern society. Or perhaps
you end up with no decision.
Right, which in fact is probably what's much more likely as soon as you add any sort of scale. So people actually experimented with this. So for example, in the United States, the Occupy Wall Street movement in the sort of early 2010s tried to do a consensus-based model. And it worked for a little bit until it didn't, until you sort of get scale that's a little, the scale sort of gets too large. So, I think that in terms of trying to actually in a way, I do think there is something very attractive about an ideal where you forego, any sort of coercive apparatus in terms of getting people to do things, and you really just get people to discuss and negotiate and actually endorse how it is that society is going to be constructed. I think that would, in some sense, that would be nice if you could have people who are willing to sort of go through that process. But to have that happen, you need lots of very cooperative people who are willing to make lots of concessions about things that they care heavily about, are willing to invest lots of time in having those sorts of discussions. And on a sort of large scale society, I think that's probably unviable. I think it can be a nice model when it comes to sort of smaller groups of people interacting. For example, when you do things with your friends, when you do things with your family, often I think people do sort of naturally operate much more on this model. Right. The tendency is to say, when you go out with your friends and you're trying to decide where to go to lunch, you're usually not going to say, oh, well, where should we go? You'll try to find something that's acceptable to everyone. You're not just going to say, oh, well, the three of us we're going to vote on it. And if 3 out of 5 of us say we're going here and you hate this place, well, too bad. We're going to go there. We're going to make you go, even if you don't want to go.
You've hit the point, because in that context, people can opt out with very little cost to either party. So if they absolutely can't agree to all go to the same place, then they can go to different places. Society doesn't work like that.
Right. There's not that sort of exit option. Right. So that's sort of something that lets consensus function, is people exiting. I mean, but there are certain situations where even then you aren't necessarily able to exit easily, in certain, for example, when you're trying to decide how to do things with your family, you'll often, you can't sort of just leave your family, especially if there's sort of a high stakes decision that has to be made, sort of collectively. And, usually people will try to sort of figure that out and engage in something like a consensus process. And I think there's something attractive about that, rather than sort of just, making people do things they don't want to do. But like you said, I mean, I take your point, and I don't disagree that I think that actually in terms of like, when it comes to governing a large society in this way, it's not clear exactly how practical that will be, which is why in some sense, I think the emphasis of anarchism should be shifted a little bit, a little bit less in terms of sort of doing away with the state and more sort of assessing the moral status of the state. What are our obligations with respect to the state? And that's more, I think, what the anarchists should say, is they should say, well, maybe doing away with the state is impractical, but how should we understand the state? And I think that the fundamental sort of anarchist answer to this question is they should say, well, the state is illegitimate, but it can sometimes act justly. So there's sort of a distinction that can be drawn here, where just sort of the thought is, well, a legitimate state is one where, and sort of when you're at least talking about moral philosophy or political philosophy, a legitimate state is one that you have obligations to obey in virtue of the fact that it's a state. So when the state issues a law, for example, it says, you have to only go 40 kilometers per hour in this area. The thought is that, if it's legitimate, you actually have some obligation to comply with that law. Even if you wouldn't get caught, for example, breaking the law, even if the law doesn't sort of serve any broader purpose, it's just, in fact, in the virtue of the fact that it's a law, you're obligated to obey it. And I think that probably a lot of people assume, I think that the dominant assumption is that people have is that states are legitimate in this way, that they have this sort of special right to impose obligations upon people, which explains why they're in fact then justified in punishing people who break the law.
So then the thing that I want to drill down to is, are you saying that in all cases the state is illegitimate, but we should put up with that illegitimacy once in a while because the state seems to do good things, it has a good outcome?
Yeah, exactly. So
but you maintain the position that the state is illegitimate.
Yes, exactly. So basically, the thought is that the anarchist denies that the state has this sort of special power to impose obligations. You don't have any obligation to comply with the law simply because it's a law. But there are some laws that you might think are just because you sort of have an independent moral reason for thinking that people should follow those laws. And in that case, you should follow the laws. So for example, you shouldn't murder people. But the sort of anarchist says, yeah, you shouldn't murder people because, say it violates some of their natural rights. Right. The reason that you shouldn't murder people is not, the state has a law against it. The laws are sort of irrelevant, but you say, when deciding whether or not to follow this law, we have to consider independently whether or not it's justified. And if it is, you should follow it. And if it's not, then you can sort of discard it and ignore it.
Okay. Well, let's say then, for example, the plastic bag tax, is that something that is moral outside of its enforcement by the state?
Well, so I mean, that's a good question. It's a sort of a big question because it gets to this, then obviously like this sort of anarchist position, it calls out for this question. Well, what is the sort of independent moral theory that we should appeal to when assessing, the justice of various laws? And I think the answer that I give, and that I think many anarchists would want to give, is that morality is typically a function. Well, I mean, there's many sort of facets to morality, but I think a major one that anarchists are going to be committed to is a sort of egalitarianism when it comes to how resources are distributed and allocated to people. And so, for example, there's a variety of different sorts of egalitarianism. I can get into the technical details if you want, but sort of loosely, the idea is, I think is an attractive way of describing egalitarianism is that every person should have, should be able to live an equally good life so long as they don't act in certain very negligent or culpable ways. So, you shouldn't end up worse off than other people as a matter of luck. And I think that's a pretty powerful tool for then assessing things like practical things like the plastic bag tax.
Yeah.
Right. So
I'm choosing that for a particular reason because
Okay.
It's not something that's obviously moral that a shopkeeper should collect the plastic bag tax or that the shopper should pay it. But in aggregate, it has a significant benefit to society. And it is something that not alone is not obviously moral, but it's not obvious that that particular goal should be achieved in that particular way. And probably if you've got 1,000 people in the room, you could get 1,000 different ways to at least attempt to achieve that goal. But you do need some sort of level of organization at a society level to say, yeah, there's lots of ways we could do this, but this is the way we're going to do this. And this is how everybody's going to do it. And that it's a long causal chain, but that does offer a significant benefit to society. And in that long causal chain, there are lots of paths that you could have gone down but chose not to, but you do have to choose one. To me, that seems to be how the state gains legitimacy, because a decision needs to be made, and that's a method for making it, isn't it?
So, right. So I think there's a few questions here. So there's one is the question of, is the state legitimate when, in the sense that it's able to, when it imposes the plastic bag tax, like, is it legitimate when it does that? A second question is it justified when it does that? And a third question is, what should you do as an individual person when you say sort of are deciding whether or not to enforce the plastic bag tax? So what I want to say is, I want to still say that the state is not legitimate per se. So it says, so say the state says, well, so here's this whole array of ways that we could solve this problem, right? There's many possible paths that we could take. And if somebody sort of just chooses one, then we'll be able to solve the problem. But if, no sort of single path is chosen, then people fragment and you sort of have a collective action problem and the problem goes unsolved. And what I'd say is that gives the state reason to sort of, if you're in the position, you're the state, you've got all these armed people at your disposal, that maybe gives you reason to make people pick a particular path. Because if you don't, then you end up with, say, a very bad outcome from this perspective of, egalitarian justice or, whatever your preferred moral theory is. Yeah. Right. And I think that sort of then justifies the state in sort of making people do that particular thing, right? If justice requires that people do, one of these three things, but it's got to be one, and you're the only person positioned to actually get them to do a particular one, then I do think, you have some discretion to arbitrarily choose which of these things people are going to do. Assuming that they're all equally good options, equally good paths of getting there.
But some people, but it can. I guess my question is, and you phrase it well that you have to choose one of these three paths. You could choose any of them, but everybody has to choose one of those. There needs to be a mechanism to make that decision. And if you have a free-for-all, there are situations where the free-for-all will not work and you need a choice to be made. And we have a lot of democratic input into how that choice is made. People may poo-poo it. Ireland is in the very top echelon of what are regarded as the most democratic countries in the world. What's the issue with that?
Right. So here's maybe the sort of thing to tease out. Which is so you have multiple paths, and then there's a question of, well, why choose one path over the other? And basically what I want to push is sort of a substantive justice-based conception. So I want to say, there's something we should do. We have justice-based reasons to do it. And so if you're the state, you should make people do that particular thing because justice requires it. But I want to say anybody could, if you personally just happen to be positioned such that you could make everybody do it, you say you were, you became the emperor, or you just, say you were a superhero and you had some kind of special power to, that made you actually sort of more powerful than the state. You could kind of make people do, what it is that you wanted. Yes. Then you would equally be entitled to make people do that because there's justice-based reasons to do it. So the thought is that,
no, Jesse, pause. That's theoretically possible, but in reality, given the complexity of our society and our economy, there is no way that one individual would be able to have or process all the information to make that decision.
Right, sure. So there might be limitations that sort of keep you from actually having sort of a good read on what this what it is that people should do.
Mm-hmm.
There's sort of a questions about, and obviously just practically, like you, as a matter of fact, in society, you can't sort of make people all pay a bag tax. You couldn't go around and sort of impose your own bag tax. But if you could, and if a bag tax is just, then I think, you would be entitled to do so. So basically, I think the anarchist claim is that, as I sort of articulate, is that there's nothing special about the state, right? The state, sort of in the anarchist perspective, is basically like a large gang, right? It's sort of like a mafia.
Mm-hmm.
It's a group of people. They sort of, they've got coercive force. They can make people do things. They can very effectively make people do things. But, you could form your own gang if you wanted, and you would then be equally entitled to sort of make people do things. Specifically, you'd be entitled to make people do things if you made them do all and only those things that were just,
mm-hmm.
right? So that's sort of the anarchist claim, right? There's nothing special about the state, right? What matters is the substantive outcomes that are realized and what justice requires. And so the thought is that every actor, whether it's a single individual actor like you or a group actor like the state, right? Every agent has the same sort of moral permissions and obligations,
mm-hmm.
and that is to sort of act in the way that justice requires. Right. So to sort of get to your point, maybe something that can help clarify this idea is, you sort of talked about democracy, right? You're like, oh, well, it's sort of one thing about the state is that it's democratic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, there's some anarchists who are very interested in democracy and think democracy is a very important ideal, but there's also been a sort of a historical anti-democratic tendency among anarchists as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of lean a little bit more in that direction because I sort of say, to sort of present this attitude, the sort of thought would be, well, so there's things that are just and things that are not just. And if the majority votes sort of to make the state sort of make everybody do the just thing, then that's great. But that's because it's the just thing. If the
mm-hmm.
majority all voted to make you do the non-just thing, well, then that would be bad. The majority sort of has made a mistake. And you're not obligated to do it just because the majority of people, say that you need to.
Sure. Pause on
yeah.
that. And there's absolutely the problem of the tyranny of the majority. And one of the ways, imperfectly, that, we've kind of discovered to cope with that is to have a constitution or a basic law that sets out principles which all of the laws must follow, and a Supreme Court that makes sometimes unpopular decisions, that overturns laws that are democratically passed but breach one of those principles. And, people have, at least theoretically, agreed to those principles and agreed to the fact that all of the laws must follow those principles, even when there are exceptions that the majority would prefer to breach that principle in a particular case. And you could perhaps say that that is an imperfect way of coping with the issue of the problem of the tyranny of a majority. But I'm not aware that anyone has come up with a better way. And a lot of what you say, despite I think you're very politically far away from them, it sounds like what the Libertarian Party in the US might say. They're typically very much on the right, but they are very anti-government, and I think have very weak answers when you ask them about what about enforcing rights of weaker people.
Great. Yeah. So, I think you're not wrong to draw a connection between the sort of the view that I endorse and the libertarians, because in some sense, that's how I characterize my view. Mm-hmm. And anarchism generally is, I think, the way to think about anarchism is it's sort of a libertarian path to socialism. Mm-hmm. So it endorses a lot of the views that libertarians have about, say, the state, but then sort of says, well, if you take those views seriously, then you actually should endorse many of the prescriptions that sort of are associated with the left and the socialist left in particular. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that's actually, so you're right to note a parallel here. And I think that, that is sort of the line that I'm pushing is, and I think something that most libertarians would endorse. They say, yeah, there's nothing special about the state. The state is just sort of a large armed gang of people. Granted, it's democratically responsive, but, democracy isn't necessarily a legitimizing force. The fact that a majority of people happen to endorse a particular outcome does not mean that you have any obligation to realize that outcome. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily make it permissible for you to be forced to realize that outcome. Mm-hmm. Right. And then there's sort of, I think that does point toward the sort of libertarian alternative, which is to say, no, the only thing that legitimizes, when we're talking about what it is that sort of makes force permissible, when can you permissibly force people to do things? Well, to do that, you just sort of have to look at what morality independently requires. And that's sort of the right lens for thinking about politics. And then you have to present your own substantive conception of what morality requires. And that's where I sort of propose a sort of very left-wing egalitarian position. And I think that's sort of what anarchists would say. But that's sort of the thought is it's like, the state, it just doesn't have any special role. The fact that people vote and the fact that, maybe a Supreme Court makes decisions and the fact that, the legislature passes various laws, it's just a bunch of people in a room sort of doing things, but that doesn't generate any special obligations for you to do things, right? Rather, you should just be guided by justice.
Okay.
That's
pause
the
with that. And you talk about this, the lack of the special position, as you see it, of the state. One of the things in morality, you will get the term utilitarianism, in other words, what works. And you say that there's no moral difference or no particular difference between the government and just a private gang. Isn't it the fact that the enormous difference in the outcomes gives that moral difference? That where you have a strong democratic state, it is observably true that you get vastly better economic and social outcomes. And where you have countries run by private gangs, the unfortunate places like Somalia or Nicaragua or in this world, or Honduras perhaps, they have an utterly awful standard of living and quality of life, and basically every metric that you could think of is awful in those places. And the private gangs, as you put it, are largely responsible for that. And it is notable that where government collapses spontaneously, such as in Somalia, those private gangs spring up pretty quickly. And where government is collapsed by those private gangs, they become very strong as well. For places like Honduras, isn't the outcome an important metric here?
Oh, yeah, no, so certainly. So I am sort of outcome focused in a way, right? So, I think I'm outcome focused in the sense that I think that justice has certain prescriptions and that people are obligated to try to realize those prescriptions as best they can. It's just sort of, in my view, it's something like, egalitarian, sort of maximal egalitarianism, where it's you want people to be as well off as possible in a way that's also egalitarian. So sort of maximizing equally situated people.
Hang on a second here.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is you want to maximize two potentially competing metrics. And the joke about communism is that the shortages will be distributed evenly among the masses. If you are to choose between equality and well-being, would you choose people to be equally badly off?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and this is sort of one of the big challenges to egalitarianism. Is the sort of, it's often called the leveling down objection. And the worry is that if you take equality seriously, do you think that there is reason to sort of maybe leave everybody worse off than even if so it's to nobody's benefit if that's what's required to realize equality. And on my view, I sort of have a bit mixed view. I probably take a slightly harder line than some. Many egalitarians sort of flee from this conclusion. But at the very least, I'm tempted to say that people. There's some caveats here, but roughly, I'm tempted to say that people, at the very least, the worse off, have a right to be sort of treated fairly and to sort of end up equally well off to other people. They could waive that right if they'd like, but I do at the very least think that there is something fundamentally unfair if there's sort of inequalities emerge, and that that sort of those inequalities demand justification. And if justification can't be given, that's something of a moral trump, even over the value of welfare. So I usually do think that under certain circumstances, the worse off have a right that things be leveled down and people be equalized. I think that they should waive that right.
Why?
Because I think that fundamentally the benefits to the better off are unable to sort of. I don't think that they are able to justify the inequality itself. So suppose that you're worse off than I am, right? I think that gives you that gives you grounds for complaint, right? You might say, this is unfair. You're better off than me. Why is that? What justifies this? And I think something that is not a plausible answer is for me to say, well, because of the extra well-being that I get. Like, look how much happier I am because of this inequality.
No, you slipped something in there. Not because of the inequality, because of the fact that they have more resources, but independently of the poorer person being at an absolute level. Well,
I say because of the inequality, and just in the sense that it's the inequality.
And that's because there are two things that are knotted together there. One is the actual fact of the inequality. And I would agree that can be problematic sometimes, and I'm going to come to that. But it is a distinct thing to say that I'm poor and I don't like it, but I will like being poor more as long as the next fella can be made as poor as me.
Sorry, could you rephrase the objection slightly?
So there is a distinction between saying somebody has taken some stuff that would otherwise be mine and is causing me to be poor. There's a distinction between that and saying the other fella has had good ideas or prospered in some way that doesn't affect me, other than the fact that I'm sort of jealous of it and have to live next door to him and he has a bigger car or a nicer house and so forth. So and what you perhaps called the leveling down, there is I would distinguish between that and there are other effects of inequality, which I will get to. But just that specifically, how does someone being better off than you, independent of your own position, make you better or worse off?
Right. So So of course, I don't think it makes you better or worse off. If they're better off or worse off.
Yes. So that's what I'm getting to. So how does that end up being immoral, or how do you end up having some right to have any say over that?
Well, because I think that the inequality itself is something that demands justification. Right. I think the fact that you have different, that your lives go differently is something that needs to be justified. Right. So I think the worse off have, they can raise a complaint about this. Their complaint, is not, as you point out, right? Their complaint is not, oh, why do you have these resources rather than me? Right? Because I think that's a very persuasive complaint. And in most cases, most actual inequality is like that, where, the fact that somebody is better off, they're sort of better off at the expense of the worst off, right? You could redistribute from one to the other and raise the position of the worse off at sort of the expense of the better off. And I think that's a very powerful claim. It's a slightly weaker claim if, somebody's better off and somebody's worse off, and there's just no possibility for redistribution, right? So
leave that out with, or even to make it to lower the bar, that the person being better off is not in any way impacting the person who is worse off. You're saying that is immoral, and that's something that's perhaps internal to you. But why would society want to do anything about that, which would only bring the better off person down?
Okay, well, so as a technical caveat, strictly speaking, I actually do think that in cases where there's just no interaction between people, then for sort of lengthy reasons.
He's got a nicer house across the street. He's got a fancy car in his drive, and I just don't like it. Should I burn down his house?
Well, right. So supposing that there's no redistribution possible, right? Because this is why it's tricky. Because even in that case,
no. I want to refine it a little bit more than that. There may or may not be redistribution possible, but the existence of the person who is better off is not at the expense of somebody who is worse off. Let's say we both put it down to agrarian terms. We both have the same amount of land, same quality of land. We both plant a crop, but your man is cleverer at it, and he knows which crops to mix together, and he has improved his farming system, and therefore eats better.
Well, but in some sense, I want to say even then, if they're sort of members of the same sort of spatial region, even then, in some sense, I think the person is better off at the expense of the worse off, simply because, they sort of produce better crops, and the worse off, could come and eat some of those crops, and equality could be realized in that way, right? So you could raise up the position of the worse off. So the only situations in which, sort of genuine leveling down only occurs in sort of weird cases where actually no redistribution is possible, right? So it's, for example, like you and I have separate farms on separate islands, and we can't reach each other, right? And then you end up better off than I am. Right. And in cases like that, then there really is no way to redistribute. And when there's no way to redistribute, then it's the case that the sort of you being better off does not come at my expense. Right. In that case, there's no way that we can sort of take from you and give to me. Right. We can only take from you. So technically speaking, I think that in cases where, you are sort of separated like that, then actually the inequality is fine. And that's for sort of technical reasons that I go into my book. We probably can't talk about it here just because it's a whole, extremely lengthy thing.
Okay.
But to sort of, maybe to stay sort of focused on the sort of the core issue, because there are maybe sort of weird marginal cases where people are in the same society.
Well, I want to go to my point on this, because it seems like in very many cases, the way that equality is achieved, or at least tended towards, is by prohibiting betterment or obstructing betterment in some other way. And that is essentially how it has been achieved in countries that have attempted to stay with the communist system. And it is extremely notable that, and people will, for example, talk about poverty, and there is great poverty in the US, but being poor in the US is an awful lot better than being rich, for example, in Cuba. And the direction in which those leaky boats sail is all one-way traffic from Cuba to the US. So people clearly prefer that system. And I've been to Cuba and I've seen there, and people go hungry. And people go hungry while there is fallow and uncultivated land that is obstructed from being cultivated. And it is not only leveling down, it is like leveling down right to the bottom. There is a real problem with that. And I think the problem springs from the fact that if somebody attempts a betterment, they will have all of the fruits of that betterment confiscated from them.
So one thing that we sort of have to clarify, right, is that, when you sort of talk about the deprivation of the worse off, right? So in a genuine leveling down case, right, the alternative
here's my objection to it. You don't just level down to the lowest in society. You level down to the lowest in society and you keep going down. That's the experience.
Right. So the question is, if you actually were to, leave people worse off, right? If you leave there's a question of how are the worse off affected by any sort of given distribution of resources.
Yeah.
And
without a question, in many communist societies, the worse off are worse off than they would be if they were the worst off without that communist system.
Right. So what I want to say in these cases, right? So I want to say, so suppose that you're deciding between, sort of a very low level of equality and say a much higher level of inequality, right? So, let me start to clarify. So an equality where people's well-being is low, or an inequality, but where even the worst off have higher well-being.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. And so what I want to say is, on basically the way that I sort of, on my view, I say people have a right to equality, but they can waive that. So in that case, right, so I think that actually,
does it have to be done unanimously?
Well, it's each individual person. So, it gets very complicated when you sort of start to talk about how does equality look in aggregates. But I'm interested in any sort of,
go ahead.
For any given pairwise comparison, right? So suppose that you and I are deciding between, there's an option of, us each having, say 5 levels of welfare, we'll be very abstract here. Each of us have 5 units of welfare, or alternatively, I have 10 and you have 20. What I want to say in this case is I want to say, well, I have a right that we each have 5, but I can waive that right. And if obviously I should, right? Welfare is valuable. It's valuable to me. I'd rather have 10 than 5. So, why wouldn't I waive it? But suppose I didn't, right? Suppose that I'm stubborn. I say, no, we each should have 5. Well, in that case, that's maybe a bit, it's maybe even like a bit mean spirited of me. But at the very least, I don't think I wouldn't have any basis for complaint, right? As the worse off, because, I could have had the better, I could have been better off, and I could have permitted the inequality, but I chose not to. So what I want to say is, given that sort of structure, right, given that I have this right that I can waive, if we end up in a leveled down situation per my demand, at the very least, that's not problematic from my perspective as the worse off, right? You can't sort of complain. There's no basis for
hold on. Why does the person who is insisting that they stay at having 5 units of welfare, what right do they have to intervene in the other person's life to say that not only can you not fulfill your capacity and get to a level of 20, but you can't even get to the level of 10?
I think the reason for this is because we sort of live in a world of shared resources, and there's a question of how those resources should be allocated, and specifically when we are permitted to use force to sort of keep other people from using those resources. And I think that we have to sort of the right sort of answer in terms of what permits people to sort of use force to govern the use of resources. We have to appeal to considerations of fairness.
Yeah, but hold on
I think that fairness.
Welfare. I'm reminded of the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which said, which I thought was quite perceptively, that a motorcycle or any piece of technology is metal and plastic and whatever mixed with an idea. And the phone that you have in your pocket, I'm sure, that I have in my pocket, contains a specific amount of plastic and metal and other resources. The amount of those resources that it has is far, far less than the phone that was in the hall of my parents' house when I was a kid. It just physically weighs an awful lot less. It's got less stuff in it, but it's vastly more powerful because of being mixed with much better ideas. And it can be quite difficult to unpick where the value springs from the idea and where it springs from the content, from the actual physical stuff. And you are correct that the physical stuff is limited, but the human capacity is, over time, is functionally infinite. And that's where most of the extra resources, the extra welfare is coming from, isn't it?
It's funny. So, because I feel like now you're sort of staking out the position that sounds a little bit more like the Libertarian Party of the United States. So basically the thought is, well, what would justify these inequalities? So this is sort of, I think, gets at the heart of the sort of questions I'm interested in when it comes to distributive justice. I'm actually asking a more basic question. I'm saying that to the extent that one person can have autonomy over their own lives, yeah, sure. But I don't get why somebody would be allowed to have autonomy over somebody else's life and say that you're not entitled to advance yourself. And by the way, experience has been that when people are, who are perhaps driven by initiative or good ideas or talent or whatever, are allowed to advance themselves, the society as a whole, including the poorest people in the society, also advance very significantly. Right. So there's 2 points you're making here, right? So one is that, the sort of inequality can be to the benefit of the worse off, right? And then the second is the sort of idea that, well, maybe people...
It's not the inequality itself, but an attempt to eliminate that inequality can be to the detriment of the worst off, perhaps we can say.
Right. I think these two things are correlative, right? They're sort of two sides of the same coin. And then I think, right, and then there's sort of a separate question of, what would justify sort of, there's sort of a question about resource use and whether or not people, perhaps by adding value to resources, for example, whether or not that might sort of entitle them to use resources in a way that generates inequalities. Right? So there's two different sort of justifications here that are sort of very different and associated with sort of very different parts of the political spectrum. Right. So the first one is the one that I sort of was trying to address before, right? That inequalities to the benefit of the worst off. Right. And basically, on my view, by giving people sort of rights to equality, I think that largely diffuses that worry, because you say, oh, well, inequality is to your benefit. So, therefore it actually is bad for, it's actually bad for you if we realize equality. So how could justice ever demand, realizing the equality instead? Right. It's a justification that appeals to the sort of position of the worst off. It appeals to their well-being. Right. But I want to say, by giving them sort of moral control over this inequality, right, by saying that they have a right to have that equality, but can waive that right if they like. I think that largely diffuses the complaint, because then if the equality obtains and they're worse off, right, you can't now complain about this on their behalf, right? You can't sort of appeal to them and be like, oh, this is actually unjust because it's so much worse for you, the worst off. I think you can no longer sort of appeal to their well-being, because they can say, well, yeah, but I could have waived this. Like, I could have been better off, but I chose not to be. That might be an irrational choice on their part, but at the very least, it is their choice, and that sort of seems to be legitimizing. Right. So I think that's if you think of people having a right to equality, this sort of concern largely goes away.
I'm not sure that it does, because people can be selfish and people can be capricious, and if they have this ultimate veto over development or the advancement of society, it certainly could be exercised for selfish or capricious reasons.
Well, it wouldn't be selfish per se, because it's not working to their benefit, right? But it could be capricious.
Yeah, but they may not perceive the benefits in the same way. They could be wrong about the potential benefits for them.
Right. So maybe they make a bad judgment. And I mean, then there's sort of questions about, there's sort of, questions about informed consent that sort of arise here. But what I would want to say is, at the very least, in the pure case where they're informed, it seems fine if you sort of level down at their behest. Right? If they don't think that they're leveling down and they actually are leveling down, yeah, that's a bit more fraud, and I'm not fully sure what to think about that. But at the very least, in sort of the sort of paradigmatic cases, if we're just concerned about leveling down, right? What I want to say is, I'd say, well, yeah, if it's leveled down at their behest, so the complaint about leveling down can't be that this is bad for them, because it's they're sort of insistent upon it. They could be better off. They choose not to be. So appealing to their sort of welfare, their lower level of welfare, doesn't seem to do the relevant sort of justificatory work when it comes to the inequality. Now,
hold on for a second.
There's a second side.
No. I want to kind of explain that a bit more, because there are different sectors in society, and you can imagine that, for example, the people working in the VHS video cassette factories would have liked to veto the development of DVD players, and the people working in the DVD factories might have liked to have vetoed the development of downloading or online TV services. And what you are doing there is you're giving an enormous veto to essentially an installed power base, to the current setup. And that's an enormous deterrent against advancing society, isn't it?
I mean, it does give them veto power, and in some sense, that's sort of the point of a right, is to give people a degree of moral control over what happens.
Why should, for example, the workers of the VHS video factory, why should they get that veto? What's the moral excuse for that?
Because the alternative would be that, alternatively, the distribution would be a sort of unfair distribution would arise, where they're sort of worse off through no fault of their own. And so that's sort of what you give them a veto against, is it's a veto against unfairness, against this sort of, it's the thought would be that the inequality can't be justified to them. And so that sort of is why they get a veto, because only by them waiving their veto does the situation become justifiable. Once they waive their veto, that sort of is the form through which
you're resting an awful lot on the hope that they will see the light and waive their veto. We actually have a very clear example of this in Ireland. I know you come from the US, that you will be familiar with touch tile phones, which was the development. They came about 20 years later to Ireland because the telephone worker unions who effectively controlled the telephone company, they basically said, we don't like this technological development, and they effectively vetoed it for about 20 years. And that much older, much less reliable technology was imposed on people. I do understand how that's, a much more highly automated system, and that clearly means that you can have fewer people working for the telephone company, and therefore some of them are likely to lose their jobs, or at least not get a job for their kid coming into the company or whatever. But I don't see how they have a moral right to impose that cost, the cost of missing out on that development, on the whole of society.
Right. So, so that's sort of a complaint that maybe, so it's a slightly different complaint, right? So there's a complaint that the better off would make, right? So suppose that you're the telephone operator, and, this new technology will come and it will, improve everybody else's lives. But suppose it's, not yours, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So the benefit is highly distributed. The cost is highly focused on a small group. That small group is then very motivated to veto it, even though the net benefit to society is very large.
Well, so I think you've actually made this case sort of slightly easier for the egalitarian, right? So because suppose that we think in terms of just the costs that people incur, right? So suppose you think that telephone operators actually incur a cost by this innovation, right? So all these other people benefit quite a bit from the new technology, but they lose their jobs, say, and now they're unemployed and their quality of life goes down dramatically, and they're sort of maybe end up in poverty, or maybe not poverty, but they live sort of poorly while everybody else is sort of off having a nice time with their new technology,
or perhaps they're brought down to the level that everybody else is at.
Right. So if they're brought down to the level everybody else is at, then it becomes that's just an egalitarian sort of distribution. So that's fine on my lights, right? If say that they had a little, the telephone operators were all living high, making big salaries while everybody else is, sort of in the muck, so to speak. And then, you sort of bring in this new technology, and then they lose their jobs, but that sort of lowers them down and everybody else's standard of living is raised. Well, in my view, I'm like, that's actually morally required, right? There would be an obligation to sort of do away with their jobs, because that would be sort of what would realize a fair, equal distribution of well-being. Right. So in that case, I don't think, then there's no disagreement, right? It's like, bring on the new technologies, right? We want new technologies that raise people's standard of living and that equalize. Right. It becomes harder. Well, right. So then there's no disagreement. The disagreement emerges potentially when actually the telephone operators they'd be worsened, right? When an inequality would result from the sort of introduction of this new technology. So there's sort of a question of, do they get this right to veto the new technology? If it sort of worsens their position and generates an inequality. And there, I think the answer is actually, there it's easier as an egalitarian to say, why wouldn't they get a veto right? Because it's unfair to them if you introduce this new technology, right? We have this new technology. We're trying to decide whether it should be introduced. It's going to have this sort of distributional effect. So there will be winners and losers. How do we decide?
I want the listeners to clearly understand that. I can't telephone you, Jesse, on a telephone system that I buy or install or whatever, because somebody down the road who can keep doing what they're doing, but is likely to be outcompeted by what you and me are doing. You and me can't do that because somebody down the road doesn't like it and they think it'll threaten their livelihood. The history of economy is littered with examples of innovations being blocked by the very conservative vested interests. And I think you're wrong to make the distinction that, if they're being worse off, then they have you're saying then they have a right to exercise their veto, because these innovations are coming all the time. And everybody gets their turn, perhaps, at being the one upon whom the cost of the innovation falls. But the cost of living in a society where innovation can so easily be stymied is much bigger.
Well, right. So again, the question you have to ask, I mean, it's a lot hangs on how we understand this case.
Yeah.
Right. So, right, if you set up the case in certain ways, right? So if you think, oh, the case is that, well, each of us, new technology is introduced, each of us takes a hit, but all of us end up better off, right? So suppose there's person A, B, and C. Each of a new technology, X, Y, and Z comes in. For each technology, one person loses their job, but everybody else ends up much better off.
Yeah.
Right. So A loses their job, but B and C benefit. But then B loses their job, but A and C benefit. And then C loses their job, and A, B benefit. Well, but in that case, you might think, well, that's great, because that's just in that case, equality has arisen, like a higher level of equality has been reached.
Hold on
like
a second. But
2 steps.
What you describe is exactly actually how the economy works, except there's not A, B, and C. There are thousands of sectors like that, and the innovations come along relatively randomly. But there's simply no question that the quality of life of somebody living in Ireland today is vastly better than it was even 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, because of technology. But I want to move on, because we've been talking about this for a long time. I want to move away from the economic argument.
Sure. Can I say one last?
Go ahead very quickly.
Yeah. So if that's the case, and if that's how the empirical things are, then there's no problem, right? Because then egalitarians can endorse that. They can say, yeah, great. If everybody ends up better off, and we can be able to sustain equality as we sort of keep technologically innovating, that's ideal. Let's keep technologically innovating. We shouldn't stop that, right? The hard cases are just when it turns out that not everyone is made better off, and in fact, some people's lives will be worse. And that's when things maybe start to come apart, and maybe the real disagreement emerges.
Okay. And I actually agree with you that in some cases you can have innovations that effectively cause a first mover advantage, that people can get rich, and there's a snowballing effect. And you see this with things like Facebook or other things where being first to the market is such an enormous advantage that you can exclude all other entrants to the market, and thereby essentially dominate, and even without the force of the state, prevent innovation. But I want to move away from that. And just in terms of state force, if your spouse is beating you, and you rely on them for income or for housing or for whatever else, isn't it good that we have the Gardaí or police or whatever to ring and to intervene on that?
Right. So this sort of gets back, to our earlier discussion, right? Yeah. And in my view, it's good to have people around who will protect your rights. And so in this case, right, if you're the victim of assault within your home, right, it would be, it's good if there are people around who will help you. It's good if communities put in place people who will help you sort of deal with that problem. And I think that that's sort of fairly non-controversial. And I think,
I completely disagree that it's non-controversial, but go on, finish your point.
Right. So the thought is that, in any case where, somebody's being treated unjustly, right? What I'm going to say is, I'm going to say, well, people, every person has reason to prevent that from happening. And that can take many forms, right? So it could involve vigilante action, right? So if, somebody's being assaulted, right? If you're walking down the street and you see an assault happening, you are morally permitted to stop it. You are likely morally obligated to stop it.
The reality is that having an organized, regulated force to stop that has proven to be a much better way to run society.
Right. So if it turns out, if the empirical fact of the matter is that, the best way to sort of keep people from being assaulted is to have an organized force, right? Then I'm like, then you have reason to realize that force, maybe to participate in it, to fund it, et cetera. And that's sort of and I think that that's fine, but it's just that the thought is that the force doesn't have any sort of special moral standing, right? It's a practical tool. It might be the best practical tool. There might be better ones but there will certainly be times when, it would be better if you just took individual action. But in general, if you might have to make certain trade-offs. You might say, well, maybe the force. Why would
individual action be better?
I think there's many cases, like, so for example, to sort of maybe make it concrete, like in the case of, say, somebody being assaulted by their partner, right? Suppose that they're also illegal immigrants, and you have a force, and the force happens to be constituted. It turns out that when you establish a big force of people, they also, will sort of deport you if you're an illegal immigrant, right? Then it actually might be better if an individual sort of operates.
Okay,
and,
so the victim is compromised in some other way and may have a reluctance to go to the authorities. That's really an edge case, though, because when you have something whereby somebody who comes across you walking down the street may have also some reason to have a vendetta against the person who is assaulting you, and may then use that opportunity to assault them much more severely than would be justified. And there's a long history of community action where when a crime is committed, the whole community comes together and decides and imposes a punishment. That's called a lynch mob. And I would contrast that with the Little Rock Nine, which I'm sure you know about. In Arkansas, I think it was, in the 1950s, President Eisenhower had ordered schools to be desegregated, and the Arkansas governor had ordered the Arkansas National Guard not to allow black students into a school, and the federal troops were sent to escort 9 black students into that school. That could not have happened without state intervention, could it?
Presumably not. It's at least, it's theoretically conceivable that a little group of people could have organized a, strong enough militia and sort of escorted them in. Would that be the optimal solution? Maybe not. It seems unlikely, but I think, in my view,
the whole point of the state is to vindicate the rights of the weak. And, it might be a polemic thing to say, but I doubt if Arkansas would be desegregated today to the extent that it is without that happening.
Well, I quibble with the characterization a little bit. Like, I think the state is, it sometimes protects the rights of the weak, and it sometimes protects the rights of the strong. Mm-hmm. It sometimes, inflicts significant harm upon the weak.
But the salient difference is when it protects the rights of the weak. Yeah, and it absolutely fails to do that sometimes, but that doesn't make any difference because the weak wouldn't have had those rights to protect in the first place. The salient difference is when the state protects the rights of the weak, which it does, not always, not perfectly, but sometimes, and it's the best we got.
Well, yeah. So, my view on this basically is just that, right? Like, I think the core, in my view, like, I feel like you're sort of trying to put pressure on this sort of anarchist position.
Yes.
And I think,
that's my job. That's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Right. The sort of the anarchist response, and I think the right way for them to go, and this is, I think, controversial among anarchists, but right. So I sort of describe it as a form of state tolerance. Right. So the thought is to say, well, yeah, maybe it turns out empirically that sometimes sort of the police as we have them today, or the Gardaí here, they're sort of, they maybe serve, they're maybe the best practical tool we have for protecting people's natural rights. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a little controversial because, it's messy because the police as they exist today, like they do all sorts of things, right? They violate people's rights all the time.
Yeah.
Especially, particularly in the US, right? Yeah. They'll violate people's rights to life. They imprison people for using drugs. They do all,
Yeah, agreed. Agreed.
Yeah.
But what you're doing is you're comparing them to an impossible perfect. If you compare them to a gang in Mogadishu in Somalia, you're doing pretty well.
Well, in terms of, how they practically do, it certainly seems like they probably fare better than those gangs. But there could be hypothetical gangs that would fare better than the police. And I think that just the anarchist position is to say,
but you would acknowledge they're all hypothetical and we don't have any working examples of them.
Well, I think that's not necessarily true because in some sense, I think people
individually,
they just sort of function as police, sort of de facto police all the time, right? Like there's, people sort of stop muggers. They will, frequently intervene to,
You're talking about in Mogadishu?
Well, not necessarily Mogadishu. Just, you see people.
Gangs. So, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, yes, you will have street gangs, yes, who will actually have quite, some fairly significant pro-social activities and will limit types of crimes that they don't like. That absolutely happens. That's the case with gangs pretty much everywhere, because they benefit from a degree of social acceptance and they see that as a way to get it. Yeah.
Right. Or I mean, and I'm even interested just in, in private individuals. Like private individuals sort of carry out coercive acts of enforcement, all the time. Like, you see two people get into a physical fight in a restaurant and, people will run over and pull somebody off the other person and sort of restrain, and they'll forcibly restrain them. And in my view, they're playing a policing function. In my view, they're no different than the police in that case. Right. They're sort of operating to sort of protect somebody's rights. And I think that that's sort of fully legitimate. Right. So that's sort of the core anarchist insight is just that the police, they are just sort of a gang. They're organized in a particular way. Maybe it's the best way we can organize a gang in terms of protecting people's rights. Maybe it's not. There could be superior alternatives that are untried. There are currently existing alternatives in like micro scales that are effective in terms of protecting people's rights. And I think that, the anarchist just says, well, these are just all of a kind, right? Just the police have no sort of real special moral status beyond perhaps having certain practical utility.
Jesse Spafford, Research Fellow at Trinity College Dublin, also the author of the forthcoming book, Social Anarchism and the Rejection of Moral Tyranny, published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you so much for your time.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, it covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, and if you could do the same as them and throw in the price of a breakfast roll or even the price of a packet of Smarties once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on the website. Also there you'll find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.